Thank you very much. And I'd be remiss in not thanking Abigail Bacon for the invitation to speak in this lecture series at the Cloud Library. And what I will be discussing is the product, in part, of my dissertation, the research for which was done almost exclusively through here, or through works, or through the help of the staff, or works obtained through the cloud. Though the funny thing is, my favorite memory of the cloud and the importance of it to me doesn't come from my dissertation research. It comes from the time I took my comprehensive exams. You see, on the morning of an exam, I was allowed to bring a dictionary to my exam, but I only owned a digital copy. So I naturally came to the library to get a print version to use during the exam, except much to my consternation, the only copy was in the reference section. Now I'm in a panic. And then the librarians did something that truly shocked me. They let me borrow the unborrowable. They let me borrow a book from the reference section. I didn't even have to check it out. Now, I didn't think about it this way at the time, but in retrospect, I'm half surprised that when I walked out the door and crossed the threshold, that the foundations of the library didn't shake or something like that. So thoroughly had the laws of the library been violated. But I ask you to forgive their transgression. Because for anyone, especially anyone who's taken a comprehensive exam, knows what they did that day is very much the closest academic equivalent to saving a life. And I am deeply grateful. And yes, I passed the exam. I'm here today. And at the end of the day, there was a tornado warning in which I had to take shelter here. So I don't know what that was quite a day. So this topic originated out of a conversation I had with Dr. Neely Fox about something completely unrelated. Is about a scene in the tomb of Seti I of Egypt, depicting the so-called 4 races. Now the Egyptians had a sophisticated view of the world, but in their artistic representations, they tended to encompass all of humanity into these 4 races, quote unquote. The Egyptians are down here. The Cushites, who lived to the south, were those here depicted with black skin. The Libyans are the folks with the feathers on their heads. And the Asiatics, think Canaan, or Syria more generally, are these guys here with the colorful kilts. What makes this scene so peculiar and what sparked the discussion between Dr. Fox and I is that these folks are all going into the afterlife together on an equal basis. But even the briefest perusal of what Egyptian kings would write about foreign peoples, you would quickly realize that they were rabidly xenophobic. They delighted in the slaughter of their enemies, in the crushing of the foreigners and insulting them and all kinds of things. So what gives? What happens? The answer relates to our topic today, but the question got me thinking about, the Egyptians aren't the only ones who have this issue. In biblical narrative, in the Hebrew Bible, we have this issue of, for the most part, a lot of times the stories are pretty straightforward narratives of conflict, sometimes peace, and alliances between various friendly groups, but for the most part, warfare. And so far, so good. But just like our Egyptian example, the relationships aren't so cut and dry, are they? Sometimes Israelites are murdering their neighbors. Sometimes they're marrying them. Sometimes it's the same person doing both. Other times, Israelites and their neighbors inexplicably switch sides. So if you look at things just through the lens of ethnic identity, you know, Israelites good, Philistines or whoever bad, it doesn't make sense. I'm going to argue that the concept of belonging takes us a long way toward understanding what is going on. However, before moving on and getting into belonging, I do want to take a brief moment to acknowledge that belonging is not the only possible explanation for certain things. A lot of other explanations for how the ancient Israelites related to their neighbors have been advanced, talking about religion, politics, economics, geography, ethnic identity, editorial inconsistencies. While there isn't time to go into all of that, I do want to acknowledge that these are valuable and they're useful and have their place and make their contributions. And I don't want to dismiss them for a second. But at the same time, they are not enough. They don't go all the way in dealing with all of the issues and all of the texts that we encounter, especially the difficult ones. And I think that's where belonging has can make a contribution. So when you think of a belonging, what comes first? What comes to mind first? And I would invite response. Also online. When you think of belonging, what comes to mind? Go ahead. Okay. So feeling accepted even when there's differences of opinion. Is that a good summary?
Being allowed to indulge in rituals of a group and marry into.
Being allowed to indulge in rituals of the group and marry into the group. And I'm repeating so that everyone can hear. Anything else? Anyone in chat? Go ahead.
I just saw another one of a term that I only picked up for like 7 years.
Go ahead.
That is from the Pharisees, the rabbis. The name Hamakom was given to the divine.
Okay.
The place.
Uh-huh.
And that echoes all through the Bible, but the idea of place, I think there's a real sense of belonging. Everybody grow up somewhere or something to go off and coming home when we all go home.
So
the lovely divorce out second century, 9th century.
I love that answer. And to summarize for everyone else, it's this sense of place is important to belonging. And I can think of a theorist who explicitly argues that. So great answer. And all of these are great answers. Any more before I move on? I don't want to rush. So if that is what belonging is to us and what we think of belonging, where does it come from? What does it include? How does it happen? How do you come to feel a sense of belonging to a group or groups, or alienated, excluded? How do the groups see some people as belonging and others not? That's a real problem today, isn't it? Nothing's changed. Nira Yuval Davis defined one sense of belonging as the feeling of being at home. And I can't remember who mentioned that, but it's something very similar. The feeling of the sense of being at home. And that sense of being at home is at the intersection of identities, social locations, and normative values. Notice the plural. Identities. No one is just one identity. And not everyone who shares the same identity feels the same way or just as strongly about that identity. Identities include racial, ethnic, gender, sexual, religious, ableness, the deaf or blind community. Different people will connect differently to different parts of themselves. What does it mean to be Jewish, for example? It may mean very different things to different people, right? And at different times. It may mean one thing to you at the beginning of your life, another thing in the middle, and maybe something else at the end. Our sense of identity shifts and changes. I could go on. Social locations. Again, note the plural, social locations. You don't have just one. Are you wealthy, poor, middle class, well connected or not? famous or just a regular person, someone who's socially respected or not, what kind of job do you have? And in some countries, you have this, you have nobility, you have royalty, or noble birth or a commoner. These are examples of social locations. And I want to pause here to say that these aren't just in isolation. If you have a certain identity, very often that identity may be associated with certain social locations. So if you are part of a minority group, you may occupy social locations that are not as respected or not as wealthy. And that could be a whole other lecture, so I'll leave that alone. Normative values. Sometimes I like to include what my wife calls the $5 words, but what normative values are the values that we have that decide which of the other belongings are important, how important they are, and in what way. These values can be drawn from anywhere. American culture, the Torah, popular culture, regional culture, Midwest nice, Southern hospitality. I'm a product of Southern hospitality, so I'll own that. Academic culture, it has its own norms and its own values. Whereas in other spheres, plagiarism may not be that big of a deal, but it's the cardinal sin in academia. It is how individuals and groups decide who is in and who is out. Do you perceive someone's race, color, nationality as desirable or undesirable? This kind of sorting happens all the time, and it's very often subtle. It doesn't have to be overt. Do you avoid this person or do you gravitate toward them? Oops, back up. So it's at the intersection, how all these things come together that make up your sense of belonging, that make up the sense of home. So it would be easy to take this and test it out on the easy cases. Unbroken conflict, long-standing friendships or peace. But I think the value of belonging as a tool for analyzing the Bible is better evaluated on the more challenging cases. Today, I will discuss 3 from the former prophets: Rahab, oops, the life of Samson, and the life of David. While I will generally use the English names, English terms, there's something about saying Rahab that just drives me nuts. So I may switch between the two, but I'll generally lean toward Rahab. It just bothers me, personally. So the story of Rahab. Since it's a spy story, I definitely had to pull an allusion to James Bond. So instead of from Russia with love, we have from Jericho with faith. Many things make Rahab stand out in the biblical narrative. The Israelites are about to conquer Jericho. Joshua sends out a couple of spies, and they immediately go to Rahab's house. And she protects them and lies to the king of Jericho to allow them to escape. And in the midst of this, gives this brilliant, beautiful confession of faith in the God of Israel. She stands out as one of the handful of pious foreigners who reverence the God of Israel in a way that would be exemplary, even for an Israelite. At the same time, she belongs to one of the more socially despised professions in ancient times and since. She was a prostitute. Regardless of certain modern perspectives on sex work, we are intended to read her as a notoriously immoral person. So there's this fundamental contradiction to what she's perceived to be, a prostitute, and this confession of faith that she gives in the story. A theological religious perspective might focus on the lengthy speech, which is certainly the focus of the story. A political or military one might consider political, economic, and geographic position of Jericho. An archaeological one would try to decide whether there really were walls back then or not. But questions lurk in the background. Why did she do it? Why risk her life and betray her own people to save the Israelite spies? Why a prostitute? Couldn't it have been somebody else? Rahab seems on the surface to be, at best, an odd choice. I'd like to argue that when looked at from the perspective of belonging, the answers to these questions are integrated. The question of betraying her own people in favor of the Israelites seems anomalous if you prioritize ethnic or national identity. If that's all you're looking at, it does seem strange. If we consider her other identities and social locations, though, a different picture begins to emerge. She was likely a Canaanite and a resident of Jericho, but she was also a woman. Her gender identity. In ancient times, as too often is the case now, women were socially inferior to men, to put it mildly. Her social location was that of a prostitute, a despised profession in the ancient Near East, and not just the Hebrew Bible. Even taking a look at the Middle Assyrian laws, for example, other stories from the ancient Near East, prostitutes were looked at almost like dirt. Or slaves. She was also likely one of the lower classes. Upper class women did not become commercial prostitutes. And we could even, and while it's a bit speculative here, so don't hold me to it, but if you think about her location living in the wall, such as it was, or whatever it was, the elites in the ancient times, especially in Canaan, built their palaces, they built their residences, their administrative centers, all the important things in the center of the city, high up at the top of the hill or whatever mound it was built on, not in the wall. She was just about as far from elite society as you could possibly be, while still being in the city. Bring these things together, we don't know what an ancient prostitute in her situation would have thought about. But from the hindsight afforded by our modern perspective, we can say that she lived her life at the intersection of three axes, not of belonging, but of exclusion. She was a woman, a prostitute, and most likely lower class or impoverished. She was at once at disadvantage on account of her gender, despised because of her profession, and likely poor. Rather than multiple points of connection to her city and her society, Rahab had multiple points of exclusion. That is without even speculating about the feelings produced by the lived experience of being in that position. In terms of belonging, her primary connection to the city was perhaps ethnic or national, and her family. Otherwise, she was on the outside of Jericho's society, looking in. So when the Israelites come along, there's very little there tying her to her society. So she cuts a deal. And in the deal, she takes care of the only other people in the city that mattered to her, the only other people to whom she felt a sense of belonging. Who was that? Her family. Now, why she decides to side with the Israelites over the people of Jericho, I can't say beyond what the text tells us. You could say that she had a change of normative values to embrace the God of Israel. So I won't speculate on that. All that we know about Rahab and her thinking is how she's portrayed in the text. Anything beyond that is speculation. But her fundamental openness to switching sides can be coherently explained through the lens of belonging, this bringing together of these three axes of exclusion. And when she does switch sides, what is the one thing she takes care of? In the deal, what is the only thing besides herself she takes care of? Her family, the one group to whom she felt a sense of belonging. So our next case is Samson. And indeed, with friends like these, who needs enemies? I don't know about you, but to me, Samson's story on the surface seems a bit weird. Samson is supposed to be an Israelite judge whose main job is to deliver Israel from the Philistines. That's what a judge is supposed to do. If you don't do that, you're not doing the judge thing. Literally and theologically, it gets even richer. Samson gets, on top of being a judge, he gets an extraordinary birth narrative, appearances by the angel of the Lord, which sets up for the reader extraordinary expectations for his accomplishments on behalf of his people. So the very first thing he does is marry a Philistine woman. What? Aren't the Philistines the bad guys? Aren't they the oppressors that he's supposed to lead Israel against and deliver them from? And then, so he's marrying into the Philistines. All right, he made that choice. But when things go sour and the people at his wedding feast pressure his wife into pestering him into giving up the answer to a riddle, he very quickly resorts to murder. If he liked the Philistines so much, why does he so quickly, easily, and frequently resort to slaughter? I must confess that when I first started analyzing the Samson story, I didn't know what I was going to come out with on the other side. He was a riddle to me, and as I began to apply belonging, I was like, what am I going to come out with this on the other side? I personally find the result fascinating, and I hope you do too. So it's what I'm interested in. So let's explore his motivations. When we start looking at his motivations, we can start with the level of identities. His ethnicity, he was Israelite. And despite periodically violently and very violently attacking the Philistines, one curious thing about him is Samson never once explicitly sets out to help his fellow Israelites. The closest we come is his compromise with the Judite elders to surrender so long as they don't attack him themselves. That's it. Well, maybe he doesn't feel a sense of belonging to the Israelites. Okay. How about his tribe or clan? The Danites. Well, not really that either. Other than the fact that the author of Judges seems to have a disdain for Dan and the Danites, they're never portrayed favorably. So in that sense, it kind of applies in that it makes sense that the poorest excuse for a judge in the Bible is a Danite. Otherwise, in the story itself, Danites don't really play much of a role. It's not a factor. Well, okay, how about his family? Maybe he feels a sense of belonging to his family. We still come up empty. He doesn't respect his parents. He rejects their counsel in evident horror at the thought of him marrying a Philistine woman. And the author could have passed from there like, oh my goodness, no, we're not going to do this. And he goes, okay, no, I want her. And they'll say, okay, we'll do it. The author could have gone straight to the wedding feast, but instead includes this little story about him giving them honey from the carcass of the lion to eat. So the second thing he does, besides wanting to marry a Philistine woman, is he makes his parents ritually unclean and doesn't tell them. Now you have to understand that that ritual cleanness is explicitly important in the Samson story. He's supposed to be under the restrictions of a Nazirite vow from before birth and for life. He's supposed to be observing ritual cleanness himself, and instead, not only does he make himself unclean, he makes his parents unclean. So his lack of respect and care for his parents suggests Samson doesn't feel much of a sense of belonging there either. And really, this whole marriage story is about all that they come into his narrative. So, okay, maybe not his parents or his family. How about as a husband? We're getting to the closest circle of relationship. Samson marries the woman from Timnah, but then he abandons her when she is coerced into revealing the answer to a riddle. He comes back to sleep with her, and then exacts a cruel revenge on the Philistines when he can't. Now, when you do something like that, kind of the obvious thing is you're expecting a retribution in return, right? People are going to come after you and your wife, her family, and he does nothing to protect her. All he does is avenge her after she's burned to death. So, can he really be said to feel a sense of belonging to his wife either? No. Well, okay, we struck out on identities. Let's try social locations. Well, he doesn't seem to be especially poor or wealthy. He does not seem to have been born into a prominent family or one that was noble in any sense of the word. He does have enough ability to travel within the region. After all, he makes a trip to Gaza to visit a prostitute. Got time for that. So other than being a judge, it doesn't seem to be a factor in the story. So this is an area where the story of Samson contrasts with that of Rahab. All right, so not so much on social locations. How about normative values? Let's talk about the expectations versus reality. Based on his birth narrative, it would be reasonable to expect that the normative values of the Torah, or at least Deuteronomy, would be central to Samson's motivations in the story. After all, the restrictions of the Nazirite vow were divinely imposed before birth, as we mentioned, and were to continue for the rest of his life. If anyone should have been an exemplary follower of God, as defined by the Torah, it should have been him. And yet, we would be wrong. As we mentioned, his decision to marry the Philistine woman is questionable at best. At worst, it violates the ban on intermarriage. As we've mentioned, he repeatedly comes in contact with dead bodies, mostly by being the agent of making them dead in the first place. He eats the unclean honey and wields the fresh jawbone of a donkey as his weapon. We might even speculate whether he consumed wine at his wedding feast, but it doesn't say anything one way or the other. So bad was his behavior, I need to move forward here, so bad was his behavior that the author has to make an apology for his parents twice. That's pretty bad. So where does that leave us? If Samson does not demonstrate any sense of belonging to Philistines, Israelites, Danites, his family, or even his wife, or social location doesn't seem to matter, and he doesn't seem to have the normative values of you would think a judge should have, has belonging failed us? I would argue no. The text is quite explicit on what motivates him in his actions: sexual desire, anger, revenge, hunger, thirst, frustration with being pestered by his wife and later by Delilah. And if you factor in the riddle episode, one might add pride and greed. His true normative values are his desires and impulses. And when they are the only things deciding what's important, we can say that Samson truly only belonged to himself. That kind of caught me by surprise, but it seems to fit for me. The closest we can come to anything more than that is that he resolves disputes with Israelites without violence, but resolves all disputes with the Philistines that way. That's about as far as it goes. So this seems to explain his seemingly contradictory attitudes towards Philistines. He acts according to his emotional impulses in the moment. See a beautiful woman? Desire, and all is well. Trick or offend him? Anger and revenge. When his desires are contrary to the desires of his parents, they are ignored and he pressures them to give in. When they do give in, all is well again. Every other character in the Samson story is treated according to their willingness to accommodate his desires or his hope for it. Other identities, social locations, normative values are almost irrelevant for him, even if they are not irrelevant for others in the story. What results for the Israelites and the Philistines alike is crisis and catastrophe. Truly, with Samson, with friends like this, who does need enemies? He causes problems for everybody. All right. So we'll move on to our third case, the life of David. Whose side are you on anyway, is my subtext for this one. Or you could even just make it that the title. There's more here than I can cover today. And you'll notice with the scripture reference I put in there, it doesn't entirely cover all of David's life, just the part that I'm really concerned with. It's still quite a bit, and I'm not going to go into detail except as necessary. Otherwise, this lecture would need to be 450 minutes and not 45 minutes. And I don't think anyone signed up for that. In context, he is the archetypical Israelite king. He follows God wholeheartedly, except when he doesn't. He fights Israel's battles, and with God's help, he delivers them from their enemies. What Samson should have done, by the way. He is the slaughterer of foreigners par excellence. He even gets his own jingle. Long before the Spider-Man song, we got Saul struck down his thousands, but David his 10,000s. Now, it's important enough that this gets mentioned 3 times. The story of David's rise and reign would seem to bear this out, from his first public step out into the public when he vanquishes Goliath, to the assorted battles accounted to his later years as king. But this ignores some rather baffling behavior in between. At a few significant points in the text, David completely reverses course and allies with the Philistines, or otherwise seeks their aid. He also reverses course in his relationship with the Moabites, but we'll have to leave that for another time. So I will highlight, for the sake of time, I will highlight a few points, and I will not go, like I said, I will not go into great detail as necessary. His early career, he's known for his victories over Philistines and his enthusiasm in killing them. When Saul asked for him to kill 100 Philistines, he kills 200. He approached it with glee and enthusiasm. But when he escaped from Saul, he takes Goliath's sword, okay, makes sense, and then escapes to Goliath's hometown of Gath before moving on. What? How does that make sense? Later, as a fugitive, David ostensibly serves Achish, the king of Gath, the Philistine king of Gath, and his warband almost becomes Achish's bodyguard. So trusted are they that they almost become the bodyguard, and part of the deal, they receive Ziklag as possession, as a gift from Achish. That's tightly integrated in Achish's kingdom. As king, switch again, known for his victories over the Philistines. And then when he's running from Absalom, David allies with Philistines once again. Perhaps you already notice a pattern here. When David's social location changes, his attitudes toward the Philistines and other foreigners change as well. So when he's a social insider, he's an Israelite insider, he's part of the army, he's moving up the ranks, he hopes to be Saul's son-in-law, and certainly after he becomes king, he is a fierce enemy of the Philistines and others. No one better. But when he is a social outsider, a social outcast, a fugitive, or at least without his previous base of support with the Israelites, like when he's on the run from Absalom, he is completely open to allying the Philistines and others, and does. One moment. His change in social location results in a change in his behavior. He doesn't like give up being an Israelite and change to being a Philistine or something like that. And yet, even looking at this, there's a tension in the story, right? For those of you who know. Just as it's simplistic to reduce everyone to their ethnic identity, so it's also simplistic to reduce David and his men to their social location as displaced migrants. Throughout the text, we see points where David is very careful not to sever his belonging to the Israelites entirely. He raided non-Israelites, but told Achish he was attacking the Judahites. He defended Keilah against the Philistines, who he was supposed to be working for. The author uses this tension so much, is not only aware of the tension, he uses it to create this dramatic will he or won't he moment, right? That culminates when David and his men are supposed to join Achish along with the Philistines to fight the Israelites. And so he's working for the Philistines, but he's supposed to be an Israelite and has been helping them. So what is he going to do? So this tension between social location and ethnic identity is being brought out and used in the story. And how does the author resolve the tension? The Philistine lords demand Achish kick David and his men out, with a reaction that might be summed up as, "Are you kidding me? Heck no." And David remains on his path to kingship. It's undisturbed. He doesn't have to make this difficult choice. But it doesn't end there. He eventually becomes king. We're back to killing everybody, conquering them, taking their stuff. But then later on in his reign, his son Absalom rebels. And I'm highlighting this because there's an episode here that's worth looking at. When he's fleeing Absalom, the author includes a brief interlude where this guy named Ittai and his 600 men join David in his exile. So why is this important? Ittai and his men were recently arrived foreigners. What kind? From Philistine Gath, living under David's authority, and went to battle with him and were trusted as much as close relatives and brought their families. Sound familiar? It exactly reverses the relationship of David and Achish. Ittai is in the place that David was before, and now David is in the place that Achish was. Instead of Israelites fleeing Gath, Philistines from Gath fled to Israel. Instead of Israelites fleeing to Gath, Philistines from Gath fled to Israel. Instead of David and his men living under the authority of Achish, Ittai and his men live under the authority of David. When the army was mustered for battle, similar to when David's will he or won't he moment, Ittai was also placed in a position of trust over a third of the army alongside Joab and Abishai, David's close relatives. That's trust. And by the way, in the ancient context, 600 people, 600 warriors, that's a lot. So what can belonging tell us? Their behavior conformed not to the expectations of their ethnic identities, but to the expectations of their social location. And it's not like ethnic identity wasn't important or that they didn't notice. David actually mentions it explicitly. He tells Achish, but you're foreigners and you just got here recently. I think literally, you just got here yesterday. It's just that ethnic identity was not as important or relevant in that situation. More could be said. So conclusions. Where I'd like to leave you is this. For the study of modern people, scholars have moved beyond merely looking at ethnic identity or even identity generally when trying to understand how and why people relate to each other the way they do. The idea of belonging has been embraced as a more robust framework that brings in not just one identity, but our many identities. Not just one social location, but all of our social locations. And considers the impact of our values. This way of looking at human relationships sheds light on the attitudes and behavior of people portrayed in the Bible. It can offer a coherent explanation for the inconsistent and sometimes contradictory behavior we find there. For Rahab, a combination of gender identity and social locations seem to play a much more important role than ethnic or national identity. For Samson, the normative value of immediate gratification of his own desires overrode both identities and social locations, and any other normative values for that matter. In the stories about David, changes to social location mattered more to his behavior than his ethnic identity, even though that never really went out of the picture entirely. While imperfect and complete, the glimpses and bits of detail we are given by the biblical authors suggest that very often the behaviors portrayed are not simplistic. They reflect the complex interplay of identities, social locations, and normative values, the complex interplay of belonging. Thank you. Oh, absolutely. It's my favorite part.
I'm familiar with the Samson story. The song, where Donnally uses somehow Hashem gives his strength back. But I have no idea about this purpose. I mean, obviously, those are prophets.
And that bit of the story is actually toward the very end. It's not even most of the account of Samson. It's only a little bit at the end. And I wanted to talk about her, but I had to watch the time. My short version of her is, and this is the world according to Steve, is she's the female Samson. They're very much alike. Can I demonstrate that from the text? No, but that's my personal feeling on it.
It's so much more complex than I think there's I was thinking about that place.
Bethlehem. Yes. I'll try. So the comment was that David felt a strong connection to place, especially where he was from, and that he very often never felt like he belonged, but always wanted to. Is that a good summary? I'm not sure that makes sense with me for me, but and part of his changes in social location also came with a change in geography, didn't it? He was away from where he belonged in other people's territory, and so that change of place could also be factored into it. So I think there's something to that. I think you're referring to the Joseph story. Okay, Dr. Kim. Okay. I think it's supposed to be significant. Oh, so Dr. Campion was saying that he was confused about Samson's social location, and the fact that I was saying that as a judge that was kind of irrelevant. I think from the perspective of the author and from our perspective, it's supposed to be relevant. It's supposed to be the central fact of his story, but he doesn't ever act like it. He doesn't do what a judge is supposed to do. Does he realize that though? And that's kind of getting further in. So but I take your point. I take your point.
It's interesting. It strikes me, again, just in terms of the composition of judges, have their person series of Israelite or legends of warriors, chieftains, and in some cases they actually function a little bit like judges. And it's so you have this folk tale of Samson and decision to create this narrative means that he has to be rendered somewhat part of the fabric, and the fabric doesn't fit.
Right.
And that's part of what's going on.
I think so.
Yeah.
And so there's this. So backing up, Dr. Saracen was talking about how that you have these different legends and stories of various heroes, chieftains, and whatnot that have been woven into this larger narrative. And sometimes the stories fit better than others, the narrative that they're being woven into, and there's a mismatch between Samson and the narrative. And I also think that I think the mismatch is deliberate, because as you see the progression of the narrative is that things go from being more or less the way they're supposed to be, not perfect, but they get worse, and so there's a steady decline. And the last of those that are labeled by the author as a judge is Samson. So he's the worst of the judges, and after that, it gets even worse than that story. So that you end in stories that are actually intentionally quite horrific at the end of the book. So yes, I think in that I was not making a sufficient distinction between like the world of the story and the layer and understanding that the author is wrapping around it. I guess that's the best way I can put it. CJ? Mm-hmm.
So how does
So the question is, an awful lot of these stories are used or thought to be used as crafting ethnic identity. And I bring into this whole piece about social location. Am I tracking with you? And that how does that influence questions of authorship and dating and all that kind of life setting? I'm not so sure. Every time biblical, okay, before I go anywhere on this, this entire subject of authorship, dating, and life setting, that's almost like a blood sport in biblical in biblical scholarship. And I'm not ready to like, I'm not really interested in jumping into the ring and planting my flag, mixing metaphors, I'm sorry, in that particular arena. I think part of the reason why it's such a difficult and contentious issue is that it depends on what you decide is important and what's not, and all those other kinds of things. What I'm saying is, what I would add to your comment and your question is that, yes, they are crafting ethnic identity and also reflecting the tensions and influences of social location and normative values. It's a both and, or both and, I guess I would say. What I'm trying to do is widen our view to include much more than we typically discuss. Okay. Okay.
And I think the reality for him in this place is not the place where he places. That's how he exists. Knows that Saul was going to kill him. Yes,
Mhm.
Establishes a semi-kingdom. But I think that the reality for him is always really God wants losing us.
Okay, so the comment was that it's not so much David's place belongingness, but where he is in his head, and following what God wants him to do in a given situation, in a given moment. And that I won't argue with that. As I said before, there are other perspectives that you could bring to these stories, and they add value and make contributions to our understanding. And in talking about belonging, I don't mean to dismiss any of these things, but simply to add to the pool of ways of looking at things, looking at these texts in a way that yields additional understanding. So I'll take that. Sure. Well, when it comes to identity, it has to be both. There's in the scholarship on the theories of identity and ethnic identity specifically, it's your own sense of which group you identify with, but also whether that group also identifies you as belonging as well. So you can't really separate the two too neatly. Am I getting at the question sufficiently? Go ahead.
Well, just a bit of that, but it would seem to me like you could apply Leviticus 19:8 to both.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And it seems like Rahab and David did that with Samson. That's not much or whatever. Yeah. Is that how do you relate to that? Do you see that going on? It would seem to me like that. If you do that, you create a sense of belonging. If you love people, you tend to increase the sense.
The question related to Leviticus 19, love your neighbor as yourself, that maybe there's some of this going on with Rahab and with David, but maybe not so much with Samson. Am I correcting?
Yeah, I'm just
okay. And how does that play into this? I'm not sure that it does explicitly, and certainly the text doesn't really hint at that. It has more to do with, to the extent that the stories deal with this kind of thing explicitly, is more done in terms of loyalty. Rahab expresses through her confession of faith loyalty to the God of Israel, and by extension, the Israelites. And the whole tension in the story is, where is David's loyalty? Where the Philistines or the Israelites? This tension between his social location, where he's kind of made his home with Achish, and also his identity as an Israelite.
You know, the Hesed, I love Nelson Glick's dissertation definition. Hesed is covenantal.
Mm-hmm.
And that, you know, that is that definitely.
Sorry. That he was commenting about his appreciation for Nelson Glick's dissertation, where he defines Hesed as covenantal loyalty.
You know, covenantal faithfulness.
Covenantal faithfulness. Sure. Well, her betrayal of her cities and her people in favor of the Israelites and cutting a deal for herself would suggest, I would argue, suggests otherwise. I just simply disagree on that. Now, whether she, these reported direct speeches that people give, that comes from the author, and so would she have, had like a rabbinical level knowledge, of of faith that would have been exemplary for an Israelite and all that. That's one thing, but the connection to the city, I think, both her social locations, her identities, and which are reflected then in her actions, would suggest that she didn't have that loyalty. Otherwise, she would have just turned over the Israelites to the king of Jericho when asked. Yep, they're upstairs. Go take them. So I would disagree with that perspective.
Well, thank you, everyone. This was a lovely presentation and a lovely exchange of ideas. So thank you very much. Again, thank you for coming. Again, you are all invited next month. And yes, have a lovely afternoon. Thank you very much.